America great again.
US Election 2024, brought to you by Striker, Hexo.ai.
Hello, viewers of the Indian Express. I'm Flora Swai, and welcome to our special bulletin on the 2024 US presidential elections. New Hampshire hamlet in the United States is already voting, and today is the 5th of November, polling day in one of the oldest democracies of the world, that is the United States of America. We are again joined today by Arthur Sullivan of DW, a political correspondent from Berlin. But before we move to him, where we speak about the implications of the US polls on Europe and transatlantic relations, let's take a look at what the impact of the US polls will be on Europe and the war in Ukraine. As the United States gets ready to vote, European leaders are closely watching the tight contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Many of them are anxious how the US election could shape the war in Ukraine and impact Europe's security. European officials are particularly concerned about a Trump victory. It is because of the unpredictable foreign policy during his previous term, his criticism of NATO, and mixed stance on Ukraine's war with Russia. Many fear that a perceived Russian win in Ukraine could embolden Moscow to target NATO members. That's a possibility Germany's spy chief has warned about, suggesting that Russia might have the capacity by the decade's end. To mitigate the potential effects of a sudden US withdrawal from Ukraine support, Europe and Biden administration have implemented strategies. It includes a $50 billion G7 loan to keep Kyiv supplied with arms. Additionally, NATO has established a new command structure to coordinate military aid for Ukraine, shifting the responsibility from a US-led coalition to NATO itself. While this provides a buffer, Europe acknowledges the US's outsized influence in NATO. Kamala Harris, as vice president, has taken a strong stance against Russia and promised continued support for Ukraine if elected, though she has not provided specific details. Trump has claimed he could end the war swiftly, yet hasn't clarified how. He has criticized US aid to Ukraine, labeling President Zelensky the greatest salesman on earth, and accused him of contributing to the start of the war. Trump's campaign spokesperson, Caroline Leavitt, asserts that Trump would restore stability worldwide through American strength and shift more defense costs to European nations. The election comes as Kyiv and its allies face new pressures, which is Russian forces continue to advance in Ukraine's east, Europe faces economic strain, and Russia-friendly populist parties are gaining ground. A senior NATO diplomat noted that as war drags on, voices questioning Europe's support for Ukraine are getting louder. To cushion Ukraine from any sudden shift in the US policy, European officials point to the $50 billion G7 loan. This amount is expected to sustain Kyiv's defense efforts through 2025. NATO's decision to move military aid coordination under its own structure is intended to reduce dependence on US political shifts, but its effectiveness remains uncertain. European officials are actively trying to influence Trump's camp, emphasizing that a Ukrainian loss would damage US standing and embolden Russia and China. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has warned that the war affects not just Ukraine but also America's future security. Not all European leaders are wary of Trump. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, a Trump ally, opposes military support for Ukraine. Some Eastern European officials even speculate Trump may escalate US involvement, potentially providing Kyiv with more advanced weapons if Russia fails to honor any peace deal he proposes. Hi, Arthur. Yesterday we spoke about the US implications on Europe in terms of NATO. We spoke about climate change and trade as well. And I want to continue in that aspect. The transatlantic economy is valued at a staggering 8.7 trillion US dollars, and it has exhibited remarkable resilience, especially in the face of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, Europe and US are deeply integrated regions in terms of geoeconomics. How do you think that at the US elections, these polls, they are going to impact the global supply chain and the overall economic growth?
Well, you said it there yourself, Flora, in terms of how important that economic relationship is between the US and the EU. From the EU's perspective, it's even more important. I mean, the US is the EU's biggest trading partner. It's currently Germany's biggest trading partner. For the US, it's not quite the biggest because, you know, the North American neighbors there, Canada and Mexico, are huge for the US as well. China's obviously huge too. But the EU is a critical partner economically for the US. So you mentioned their supply chains. Well, first of all, one of the things to say about supply chains is that the single biggest disruptor to global supply chains in the last few years was the global COVID-19 pandemic. So sometimes supply chains are hit by unexpected events, geopolitical events, not necessarily as simple as economic policy within a nation at a given time. Often the most damaging things are those kind of issues. For example, another major issue, which isn't necessarily been talked about this much in this election, but which would have a massive impact on global supply chains, is if anything were to happen in Taiwan, which obviously is a huge semiconductor producer, and we know how Trump feels about Taiwan. Again, he speaks about it transactionally. He says things along the lines of, what has Taiwan done for us lately? So when it comes to supply chains, I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive in terms of outlining what could potentially happen. But if you are looking at the simple facts of this election, the biggest impact on global supply chains based on the results of this would be if Trump were to win and he were to follow through with some of the things he's talked about in terms of tariffs. So he has talked about, for example, 60% tariffs on China, between 10% and 20% tariffs on goods from all countries in the world, which is a mind-blowingly vast array of tariffs that actually were to be followed through on. And then 100% levy on from wherever from. So if some of these promises, Flora, were to be followed through, then obviously that would upend multiple supply chains, depending on the nature of how they interact with the US economy. It would obviously, some economies would divert from exporting to the US. It would obviously disrupt a lot of those existing economic relationships. That's in the event of a Trump victory. Now, in the event of a Harris victory, obviously she's not anywhere near as stringent on trade as he is, but she would be very likely to continue with his, or not his policies. I guess they were originally his policies. Biden continued them, but the generally hawkish stance on China and on trade with China, Harris would undoubtedly continue with that. So I guess supply chains globally in certain sectors have already adjusted to this new era that we live in now in terms of, you know, rising trade barriers and tariffs. They're already in place, obviously, between the US and China, but also we see more and more from many developing countries putting barriers in place to protect their own domestic sectors from issues around Chinese overcapacity and so on and so forth. So I think Trump's election would obviously have a bigger impact, but we do live in a new era when it comes to global trade, and that's probably the way I would look at this. But in terms of your original point about the overall importance of this transatlantic relationship, I think a victory would upend that transatlantic economic relationship much more than a Harris one. That would be seen much more as a case of continuity from the last 4 years.
Absolutely. But all said and done, there has been a decline in the FDI investments because of a lot of global uncertainties. How do you see Europe changing its investment strategies post the US elections?
Well, in fact, one of the biggest issues in the EU at the moment is there's simply not enough investment, full stop. Just in September, we had a major report from Mario Draghi, a name you may be familiar with, a former president of the European Central Bank, a former Italian prime minister, and a very, very influential figure in Europe when it comes to the economy. And he was commissioned by the EU to make a major report on the EU's economic readiness for the years ahead. And one of the biggest things that he emphasized was that Europe is lagging very much behind when it comes to investment on some key sectors in terms of digital economy, innovation, AI, tech, high-tech material, high-tech goods, all those absolutely critical sectors which the US and indeed China tend to go forward on. It has an investment crisis at the moment, full stop. Its biggest economy, Germany, embodies that. Germany dramatically needs investment across multiple sectors, from the most obvious in terms of infrastructure to roads, bridges, to schools, and then to high-tech sectors, like I mentioned, such as in AI and so on. Europe has an existing problem when it comes to investment. AI startups, for example, in Europe, they tend to go to America when they get the chance. They recognize that the US has a much healthier investment climate. And so I think Europe needs, like I said to you yesterday, Flora, many times, Europe can worry about the outcome of this election as much as it wants. And it can say, well, Harris might be good or Trump might be worse or whatever. But Europe has its own serious problem they're going to endure regardless of the outcome of the election. Of course, a Trump victory will complicate lots of aspects of EU economic policy, more perhaps than a Harris one. But it's not going to solve, a Harris victory is not going to solve a very fundamental problem that you have at the moment in the EU economy. Stagnation, low growth, lack of investment, lack of readiness for the future, lagging behind the US and China when it comes to these key digital innovation areas of growth. And so when it comes to how Europe's investment strategies are going to evolve based on this election, I'm not sure we're going to see a huge jump either way. Perhaps if a Trump victory may lead to some changes in patterns. There may be some divergence of investment from the US, but at the moment there's not even that much FDI flows from the EU to the US, full stop. So I would say the bottom line here is that the EU has its own problems when it comes to investment that will endure regardless of the outcome from this election today.
Absolutely. We spoke about automotive and pharma industries yesterday in terms of Europe and US relations. We know for a fact that any policy change in Washington when it comes to manufacturing directly impacts Europe, be it the dock workers strike in the east or Gulf Coast, or be it China's dominance in the EV sector. How do you think Europe will try to sort of bolster its automobile and manufacturing sectors post this election?
Well, I think if I really knew the answer to that, I would be earning a lot of money somewhere else advising some of European car makers, because they don't know the answer to this question. They've been having serious problems to try and adjust to the new world we live in terms of electric vehicles, whether that's American companies such as Tesla, or indeed, as you mentioned correctly, the huge competition that's coming from China in terms of EVs. For Europe and indeed for America, car making, and for many countries around the world, car making is a really important symbolic industry. It goes back to the sort of post-World War II era of, everyone wanting their own car. It symbolizes so many different aspects of a strong economy across manufacturing. Car making is a very important symbolic and indeed practical industry. And in Germany, for example, at the moment, like much of Europe, is having an existential crisis at the moment with regard to its car making. Volkswagen, the most iconic German car making brand, looks like it's going to be closing down factories for the first time in its near 100-year history. Now, it may not come to pass that they will actually have to close them down, but the company has serious problems. It has struggled to adjust to the EV transition, and it's really struggling to cope with the loss of market share in China and indeed competition from Chinese car makers. Now, if Trump were to win, this problem in EU car making would be amplified significantly, because Trump has spoken repeatedly about US car making, he seems to have a real bee in his bonnet about car making above all other trade issues. He doesn't like to see German cars, he doesn't like to see Japanese cars or Chinese cars coming into the US market, and so he has spoken about putting a 100% tariff on cars across the board, wherever they're from, coming into the United States, and perhaps there would even be extra ones on Chinese cars. Now, it's important to say that this issue around EVs is not just a problem that the EU or indeed the US is grappling with. We've seen in many countries around the world, including in major developing economies of the global south, for example, such as Brazil and others, that they are taking serious steps to safeguard their own EV sort of ambitions from Chinese competition. So this is an important global issue. China is able to produce electric vehicles of a very high standard at a far cheaper price because of the fact that it's a very highly controlled state-run economy. This problem is not going to necessarily go away, but undoubtedly existing existential crises within EU car making will be made worse if Trump would come to the White House, because he would probably, on all his trade threats, I think the one that he's most likely to follow through on would be with regards to car making.
Absolutely. Trump's America First policy could be detrimental to Europe in terms of automobile and manufacturing industries. At the same time, we spoke about climate change yesterday, climate protection, and I want you to elaborate on that. The fact that US and Europe have worked on a lot of climate change projects together, especially the global methane project for that matter. However, there are also policies both of the US and the European Union, such as the US Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 and of course the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism that has raised concerns in the US. So my next question to you is sort of two-pronged. First of all, how do you think Europe's climate change policy and especially the Green Deal strategy going to work out with the new US president, whoever takes to the Oval Office? And secondly, how is the global carbon pricing and emissions reduction efforts going to pan out?
Well, I think that, to take the first part of your question, the EU across the board, in terms of most of its leaders in most countries, there's a strong commitment to the EU's Green Deal, which, there's various aspects to that, multiple pieces of legislation, multiple ambitions. But the number one is for the EU to become carbon neutral by 2050. Now, there's a lot of doubt as to whether that's going to happen, but there's undoubtedly a very clear path ahead. The EU is firmly committed to that path. And we already do see, and we've seen, in our lives for years now, those efforts to try and reduce emissions, to deal with climate change. And it's a road that the EU is clearly set on. And I don't think what happens in this election is going to ultimately change that. That's the goal. The EU is committed to it. Now, obviously, there's going to be complications. I mean, you mentioned, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act. That is a very good example of an area where there's tensions in terms of how to deal with this green transition between the US and the EU. It's been a very, very successful piece of legislation from the Biden administration's perspective, commitment of hundreds of billions of dollars, subsidies and support for green technologies in the US. It's already created a lot of jobs. It's only in the very early stages, and yet it's going really well. But from the EU's perspective, they see that as protectionism. They think, well, that's attracting, first of all, investment from some EU companies because we can't compete on that level. And in general, it's just protecting American-based firms and giving them support that maybe, EU firms can't have the same level. And so it makes it much harder to compete with them. That's an understandable gripe. And of course, on a lot of these issues, when it comes to how to deal with climate change, there are going to naturally be tensions between different governments. I mean, for example, I know with India, the Indian finance minister recently made a point of talking about the EU's proposals with regard to, you mentioned there, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. She made the point validly from her perspective, and indeed from a major, huge global developing economy such as India's, that the plans that the EU has to bring in stricter carbon pricing on both imports and indeed domestically produced EU companies, that if it were to come through, it would come through by 2026. In fact, it will come through by 2026. The legislation has already been agreed. That she made the point that this would obviously make it much harder for Indian firms and indeed for other firms to import into the EU, and that it's an unfair playing field perhaps because they're at a different stage of their development. They obviously are using coal perhaps more than the EU nations or developed nations. They're still a little bit more reliant on it perhaps in some sectors, certain industrial sectors, and therefore it's cutting off a key market for them when all of a sudden they have to pay this large levy. Now, the issue of global carbon pricing is certainly not going to go away. I mean, the US itself is talking about bringing in similar legislation that the EU has brought in on this topic. Now, obviously, a Trump victory would probably complicate that, to put it mildly. On one level, I'm sure he would love the idea of making it harder for other countries to sell to the US. On the other level, we know he is a climate change denier, so he may not even understand the concept of carbon pricing. But it's still something that may proceed with. It certainly is likely to proceed if Harris is elected to the White House, because that was obviously something the Biden administration were discussing. I know that the WTO, the World Trade Organization chief, has spoken quite a lot recently about bringing in a global carbon pricing mechanism, a system whereby all nations in the WTO are signed up to that. Those moves are obviously going to continue in the years ahead. I think while there are bumps along the way, the global path towards dealing properly with climate change, I think is thankfully an irreversible one. I think most countries do agree that this needs to happen. There's still going to be disagreements over how it happens.
Absolutely. We would like to tell our viewers that the European stocks closed lower ahead of the US elections yesterday, and the tech stocks were down by 1%. And moving on from stocks to defense stocks. Arthur, the Trump victory in the race for the White House is seen as bullish for defense stocks for Europe, given his warnings to scale back on US military support, and also the fact that, you know, if he wins, he will force NATO members to spend about 2% of their GDP on defense. So how do you think this will impact Europe's defense spending and, of course, military modernization?
Yeah, well, that's really one of the biggest questions stemming from this election. So we have to say, broadly speaking, over the last decade, gradually European stocks, European defense companies rather, have been spending more. European governments have been spending a little bit more on defense ever since the Russian Crimea invasion of 2014. So there has been a gradual increase, but that has really accelerated in the last 4 years for two main reasons. One, as you rightly said, Trump, when he was in the White House, his threats around NATO, his threats around potentially pulling the US, obviously forced European companies and European defence companies, which are irrevocably connected with their own governments. I mean, governments essentially decide what is spent on defence in most countries in the world. So since that period, they obviously realised they had to spend much more on their own defence. But I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago actually brought it home to many people's doors that this is a real threat to European security. And so we've seen, for example, several European companies, including many here in Germany, Rheinmetall, a very good example, where they've been even struggling to cope with the volume of orders they have for military equipment, for weaponry, and so on, for artillery, because of that war in Ukraine and because of a general, bullish stance being taken by more and more European governments with regard to their defence spending needs. So that's going to continue. I think even if Harris were elected to the White House, that would continue, because that trend of a new Europe, a Europe where Russia has been, restored to sort of its traditional role in post-war Europe as a serious security threat, that's not going to just disappear overnight. And so even if Harris were to win, I think that atmosphere would persist. However, if Trump were to win, it will be amplified because of his previous threats to potentially pull the US out of NATO. Now, I just can't emphasize this enough, Flora, for your viewers. If the US were to, under a Trump presidency, follow through with some of his threats with regard to NATO, that would be the end of NATO. That military alliance would no longer really exist, because the US is NATO. It contributes 2/3 of the total budget. Of course, the EU could try and muddle on, but there is simply nowhere near enough military infrastructure or personnel or spending or anything to sustain NATO in the absence of the US. So I think, yes, it would lead to a massive surge in EU defence spending, but it would also raise serious existential questions about the EU's security. So the bottom line is, Trump cannot follow through on those threats, or the EU would have a serious problem. But I would add there, I don't think he will follow through on those threats if he were to be elected. He didn't the last time, and indeed in his campaign this time, he has been noticeably more reticent on talk about abandoning NATO. He continues to say things like that he would effectively, want to do peace deal with Russia straight away after he came to power to end the war in Ukraine, but that's not quite the same as saying he would leave NATO.
Absolutely. Arthur, American military power has been protecting Europe for the past 75 years. It actually started with former US President Harry Truman when he founded NATO 75 years ago. But this election in 2024, this US presidential election, sort of poses a question: how much longer will America protect Europe? Is US still going to have EU's back?
Well, that is a really good question. I mean, we touched on it there in our earlier answer. So that transatlantic alliance, militarily speaking, NATO, it is the most successful military alliance in modern times. It has been hugely successful, coming up on close to 100 years, 3/4 of a century. It has essentially kept, the global order of peace, at least. There's obviously many other conflicts, but in terms of, there's been no world war since World War II, and that is largely to do with the strength of NATO as a military alliance. So it is undoubtedly extremely important. During the Biden presidency, he increased the number of US troops in Europe because obviously of the threat from Russia along Europe's eastern flank. He increased spending obviously to support Ukraine and also to NATO as a whole. So that was a period of strengthening for that NATO alliance. However, again, irrespective of Trump, there still is an understanding within the EU and within Germany that the US's longer-term security pivot, as it were, its eyes are increasingly drawn towards East Asia and towards China. Because while Russia obviously is in the middle of its sort of revival as a real geopolitical threat under the latter stages of Putin's presidency, everyone in the US security establishment knows that China is the longer term threat, and China's activities, whether it's regard to Taiwan or other activities in the South China Sea, the US is increasingly pivoting its military eyes towards that part of the world. And of course, Europe is the one that will suffer in that event. So I'm not sure that if that were to be followed through with gradually, as it obviously clearly is going to be in the years ahead, that's going to completely devastate the NATO alliance. It won't. That's going to continue to be an extremely important alliance, assuming it survives, for example, a Trump presidency. But Europe's defence chiefs and its leaders understand that the trend is going one way eventually, and so they need to invest in their own security as they had in previous generations. And that's, I think, the bottom line here, and that there is an understanding around that. However, making them actually step up and spend is another thing. I already mentioned the EU's economic difficulties. Finding that 2% to 3% of your GDP to spend on defence when you're so used to that American comfort blanket is hard. But it's a habit, a 7-decade habit that I think some European governments are simply going to have to break.
Absolutely. Arthur, currently, US has overall around 100,000 military personnel stationed across Europe. And the last time Trump was president, from 2017 to 2021, he sort of, threatened that he would pull some of the forces off Europe. According to a BBC report, there are many Republicans who believe that it is high time that Europe started protecting itself. Do you think it's time that Europe should start protecting itself and not be dependent?
Well, frankly, I do personally. Yeah. I mean, I think you have to be realistic as well. I mean, Europe is nowhere near capable, as I've already pointed out, to sort of meet or match the level of US investment in security. The US is the world's preeminent military power by a country mile. I mean, of course, you have the likes of Russia and China, which have significant militaries, but nothing can compete with the US. And Europe is certainly not going to compete anytime soon. I mean, for example, where I am in Germany, Germany's armed forces are really, I don't want to be too harsh, but certainly they have been at some points a little bit of a laughing stock. I mean, there are many countries in Europe which have nothing even approaching an acceptable level of military readiness in the event of the United States' absence. So it goes without saying that all these countries need to invest in their own security. We live in a changed world. It's not the same as the sort of post-World War II order where there was that sense of security and that certain plates would not shift one way or the other. What's been happening over the last few years, we have seen there is this new world we're living in. I mean, Xi Jinping said it to Vladimir Putin famously during one of their meetings in the last few years. We're living in a new world. We are part of that new world, that we're making these changes. This is something that Europe needs to understand. European leaders need to understand. We cannot always be reliant on the United States as, our main defence mechanism. Now, of course, there are governments, for example, in the EU, the French government, the UK government, where there is serious military intelligence, serious military capability. They are indeed nuclear powers. But the fact is that without the United States as that umbrella of safety there, the EU would be completely exposed to threats from other parts of the world, whether that's Russia or indeed China. So it's not something that a few years of investment is going to change, but there needs to be that longer term pivot and readiness to prepare for that day when perhaps the United States is not the ally that we all have been used to it being for many decades.
Absolutely, Arthur. And before we let you go, one final question to wrap it all up. Speaking of defense, do you think that these US polls will influence the US-Europe cooperation when it comes to counterterrorism and cybersecurity?
Well, I think thankfully that is one area where it should be relatively impervious to whoever wins the results of the election. I mean, the US and the EU, and indeed the UK has to be mentioned here in this regard, because the UK and the US have a very deep security relationship, even though the UK is no longer in the EU. That relationship does go back to obviously the end of the Second World War in terms of sort of establishing modern connections between their intelligence services. They do share a lot of information when it comes to counterterrorism, when it comes to cybersecurity. And for example, I know Trump, when he was in power, I mean, he enraged and infuriated the US intelligence community, or certainly large amounts of it, when he famously, or infamously rather, sat on stage with Vladimir Putin in 2018 and undermined his own intelligence agencies by saying that he believed Vladimir Putin's version of events when it came to US election interference and not his own intelligence agencies such as the CIA and the FBI. So I think those agencies, generally speaking, are able to endure the turbulence of political shifts, whether it's a Trump presidency or someone else. And I don't think we're going to see a change in cooperation between those in the world we live in today, even though, of course, Trump, for example, if he were to come into power and he would tend to be a more disruptive influence, he may try and have people in certain positions, but it's not as easy to do that with those agencies as it may be with other branches of the government. And also we are coming out, regardless of the outcome of this election, of a four-year Biden Democrat presidency where clearly the FBI and the CIA and the intelligence agencies have been used to that way of doing business. I don't think it will be easy for Trump to change that overnight, if at all, during a potential second term for him.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Arthur. Polling is now open in 8 states of the United States of America, including key battlegrounds in New York and Virginia. Voters in Connecticut, New Jersey and New Hampshire also began casting ballots at 6 a.m. ET, while Indiana and Kentucky will follow shortly. And the first ballot for the 2024 U.S. presidential elections was cast in New Hampshire. For all the live updates on the 2024 U.S. presidential elections, please stay tuned to the official YouTube channel of the Indian Express and visit our website, indianexpress.com. That's all from us. And now, thank you for watching.
Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. On day one, when I am elected, I will walk in with a to-do list.
Donald Trump. Everyone who simply wants to do one thing, make America great again.
US Election 2024, brought to you by Striker, Hexo.ai.